From Vermont Public, this is The Frequency. I'm Liam Elder Connors. It's Saturday, May 24th, which means you're listening to a special weekend edition of the podcast featuring the Capitol Recap. Coming up, a political sea change after the November election has brought legislative work on emission reduction policies to a standstill. That story is after this. Democratic lawmakers have spent the last 5 years laying the groundwork for the most aggressive emissions reduction policies Vermont has ever seen. But the fallout from the November election has brought that work to a standstill. In this week's edition of Capitol Recap, Vermont Public senior political reporter Bob Kinzel talks with Peter Hirschfeld about the state of climate policy in Montpelier and where lawmakers and climate advocates go from here.
Pete, it's amazing how quickly the tides can turn in Montpelier. Last year, Democratic lawmakers looked like they were on the cusp of enacting some incredibly ambitious emissions reduction policies. But this year, it feels like climate has almost been a non-issue in the legislature. What happened?
The short answer, Bob, is that during the last election, Democrats lost 19 seats in the Vermont House of Representatives, 6 seats in the Vermont Senate, and they no longer have the supermajorities they need to override vetoes by Republican Governor Phil Scott. Recall that Scott opposed virtually all of the major climate bills that Democrats have enacted in recent years. We're talking here about initiatives like the Clean Heat Standard, which sought to dramatically reduce carbon emissions from the energy we use to heat homes and businesses in Vermont. Phil Scott said those policies moved too quickly, that they would increase the cost of fossil fuels Vermonters still rely on, and that they would cause economic pain and disruption for Vermonters as well as the business community. Democrats, meanwhile, view fossil fuels as a financial yoke on Vermonters, who now spend more than $7,000 a year per capita on fossil fuels. And while they acknowledge that transitioning off of that energy will require enormous upfront costs in some instances, they say Vermont can do this in a way that insulates residents from significant cost increases while also achieving the environmental and economic benefits that come with using less gasoline and heating oil. Republicans and Democrats, so far at least, haven't been able to bridge that ideological divide on climate and energy issues. And since today's legislative environment requires buy-in from both parties in order to move anything of significance, the climate agenda in Montpelier this year has been very quiet.
Well, Pete, this new partisan balance at the State House is something the Democrats are going to have to contend with next year as well, and maybe into the future. How do you think their strategy on climate legislation will account for this new political reality?
It depends on who you talk to. I've spoken with some Democrats who want to lean into electoral politics to solve this issue. They say Phil Scott has revealed himself as an obstacle to meaningful climate action. They don't think his views reflect the will of the voters on this front. And they think Democrats can leverage this issue in 2026 and beyond to compel voters to vote out Scott, or to reestablish the legislative supermajorities that Democrats will need in order to move things despite his opposition. Other lawmakers I've spoken to say it's time to reframe this issue entirely, to take the temperature down, to focus on the things that everybody can agree on, and set out on a new, if less aggressive, plan for climate action that can win support from members across the aisle.
Pete, one thing we haven't mentioned yet is the Global Warming Solutions Act. This is the 2020 law that sets ambitious emissions reduction mandates for Vermont. It also allows people to sue the state if we don't hit those targets. Phil Scott has called on lawmakers to repeal this law. Any indication as of now of whether or not they're going to heed that call?
You know, Bob, the existence of that law really anchors everything that happens from here on out. And to some extent, it's sort of a trump card for Democrats in this debate. People like Senate President Pro Tem Phil Baruth and Kath James, the Democratic chair of the House Energy Committee, say they aren't willing to reconsider the Global Warming Solutions Act until and unless they see Phil Scott make some concessions on the climate front. If Republicans come to the table with a meaningful plan for how to more quickly wean Vermont off fossil fuels, then they say they're open to revising those emission reduction mandates or pushing out the timeline. If that doesn't happen, though, they say the best option may be to let people go ahead and sue the state and have a judge force Vermont to undertake emissions reductions initiatives that elected officials haven't been able to enact on their own. Phil Scott says he'll be presenting lawmakers with his climate action plan in December of 2026. It might well take until then to have a clearer understanding of whether Democrats and Republicans can find common cause on addressing this issue.
That was Vermont Public's Peter Hirschfeld talking to senior political reporter Bob Kinzel. You can read our full story on the status of climate legislation at vermontpublic.org. Thanks for listening to the Capitol Recap edition of The Frequency. Today's episode was edited by Mark Davis and produced by me, Liam Elder Connors. Our music is by Blue Dot Sessions. And just a note, The Frequency is going to be off on Monday and Tuesday next week for the Memorial Day holiday. So we'll talk to you again on Wednesday.
The Afghan Women of Brattleboro is a new podcast presented by Vermont Public. The series follows a group of women who evacuated from Afghanistan after the Taliban seized power in 2021 and had to forge a new path for themselves in southern Vermont.
It was not easy for me to begin like a different life in here, but I started.
All 6 episodes are available now wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search for Vermont Public Docs and subscribe.